work with a lot of you folks in the room today, and we appreciate that. As you've heard, our history is Partners RX last year. We were purchased by Magellan, and today we just want to share with you our unique vision with Magellan One. And so what that really means is we do, besides the prescription side, we also have behavioral health and radiology. And so we're bringing those all into one entity where it's going to help us when we're forecasting and looking at prescription drugs going forward. Okay. Some of the marketplace challenges we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. One of the things that I wanted to cover today specifically was looking at specific groups with Cypress, looking at the trend with Cypress, looking at our block of business, and then specifically one of the accounts here today, Menasha Corporation. And they gave us, the go-ahead to definitely use some of their specific information. But some of the things that Dick will talk more specifically to as well are the marketplace challenges, healthcare reform, specialty, some of the outcomes, some of these high-cost drugs that we're seeing, and the Hep C class, and what we're doing specifically to manage those, in addition to kind of where our trend is overall. Okay. So specifically, what I did here is we looked at Menasha, as I indicated, and what we do at Partners and Magellan, and what we've always kind of looked at as far as one of the metrics that we use is ingredient cost per day. And so whether your prescription is a 90-day prescription or a 5-day prescription, what does it cost to treat your group on a per-day basis? And that's how we measure, where we're at as far as a spend perspective. And you can see prior to coming to Magellan RX, Menasha was right around a 280 per day mark. And so just to give you a little bit of a feel for kind of where that stands on our book of business, we're at 265 on a per day basis. And Cypress as a whole, for the business they have with us, which has been about 8 years now worth of business, they're at 260. So they're actually a little bit lower than our overall book of business on the commercial side. And then we just took it a step further and we looked into our database and we said, what other history and competitive information do we have on other PBMs across the country? And you can see here, and part of this was our analysis, part of it was another PBM consultant that shared some data with us, and they were indicating the per day ingredient cost per day was anywhere from $341 to $380 to $319. And so you can definitely see that, looking at the ingredient cost per day of $265, or even where Menasha is at $271, or Cypress at $260, you definitely have a flat trend line. And what that means is your overall cost is being held down. So a lot of folks come up to me and say, well, what about your contract terms? What can you do on the contract terms? Well, we can save you on contract terms, and we're competitive on contract terms, but you really want to look at your overall claims pool and how we manage the business day to day. And it's very similar to what Cypress is doing on the medical side with Argus is what we're doing on the prescription side. And Dick's going to get more into the details about how we're managing those claims. But just wanted to share with you some of the overall numbers that we had. One of the last sheets that I wanted to share with you was the specialty cost comparison. So definitely from what Tom was just indicating, you can see in the time over the last few years from 2011 until now, what this is showing you is the Cypress percentage of spend for specialty cost and the Magellan percentage of spend for specialty cost. So you can see it's definitely increasing from 2011 at about 10%, and now the spend is for Cypress right at 26-27%, and on our book of business it's about 22%. And so that's where I'm going to kind of let Dick take over and give some more details around the trends in specialty and what we're able to do about them.
Thanks, Cheri. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the regulatory impact on the cost of health care. So more people getting care, more sicker people that have been withholding or seeking care because they couldn't afford it. So all of those things are combining to create kind of a stressor, if you will, on not only the healthcare provider side of the business, but also on all the systems that are in place to manage all of that healthcare. So we've got some pretty interesting things going on. We've already talked about an aging population. Think of a pig flowing through a python, and that's kind of what the baby boomer generation is doing to the trend line. So we got this big bulge going through there, and at some point in time, the trend's gonna change dramatically once we age out of the system. Traditional drugs are decreasing in cost. Some of you might be aware of a recent phenomenon with generics. The trend on that side of the house is increasing, primarily because there's been a significant amount of consolidation within the generic industry. There's also been some raw materials hoarding by our friends in China, so that's creating some supply issues as well. I'm sure you're all aware that there's been a fairly significant critical shortage of some injectable supplies. That's particularly important on the hospital side, but it has impacted the ambulatory side, the side of the business that we deal with, to some extent. So there's some things going on within the generic marketplace that's creating a little bit more of an impact in terms of the generic costs impacting the total cost of care. And then we've got the Medicaid population, so 15 million more people have health care now as a result of health care reform. And then the Medicare population, obviously it's increasing as the baby boomers age into retirement. So you get that big red arrow at the end of the thing, and that's the elephant in the room, right? Specialty drugs. So we've got a tremendous amount of innovation. It actually started as a result of some legislative action back in the 80s, that the Orphan Drug Act, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that stimulated the pharmaceutical industry to take a hard look at orphan conditions. And orphan conditions are diagnosis groups that are less than 200,000 patients within the US. And this population is, for a long time, has been underserved, and now because of the evolution of genomics, the gene mapping, genomic testing, getting closer and closer to something called targeted therapies, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we get on. So this is what the FDA approval pipelines looked like over the last few years, and if you notice a trend starting in 2010, the lighter green line are specialty drugs as a portion of the total approvals. So you can see that it's beginning to creep more towards the specialty side than the traditional molecule side. There's still some traditional molecule development. Most of it is what we would refer to as Me Too products, products that don't add anything radical in terms of clinical improvement, might have a little twist here and there, might have slightly better side effects, might come to market at a better price point, but don't really offer any innovative breakthroughs in therapy. And there's exceptions, but overall. The specialty area, already this year we've had 10, well this was as of March 31st, and since March there's been 3 more approvals. You may be familiar with the first biosimilar that was approved, excuse me, Farxiga. It's a biosimilar for a drug called Neupogen, which is used to treat chemo-induced neutropenia. So this is the first quote-unquote generic for specialty products. It's still in a patent litigation lawsuit, so don't know, the courts, they have a hearing at the end of May. It may be, if it's ruled in favor of Sanofi that's coming to market with this, then they'll be able to launch. If not, it might be delayed until September 15th, but it has been approved. Then there was another approval just last week on the 16th, a drug called Corlinor, and this drug is used to treat heart failure, and it's a fairly significant improvement. And again, this is on the traditional side, so it's kind of an exception. But it's hopefully going to delay or increase or decrease the amount of hospitalizations for folks that are in late-stage heart failure. And then also on that same day, the first true generic specialty drug was approved. Are you familiar with a drug for MS called Copaxone? Yes? Okay. So that first generic has been approved by the FDA, but again, it's in patent lawsuit and it's in court, and it may not be released until, or launched until late August. So, but a first true generic has been approved. So that's 14 drugs already this year, and we're just starting the second quarter. Let's see, let's talk about some other notables that are in the pipeline. So alirocumab and evolocumab, these are the PCSK9 inhibitors. This has been garnering a lot of attention in the press because it's the next big thing in the specialty category. This is primarily for folks that have a genetic mutation, familial hypercholesterolemia, and also for anybody that can't tolerate statins. And that's a fairly large population. Currently, it's estimated at about 15 million patients. These are patients that are taking high-dose statins, not getting the results that they need, either because they have side effects or they just can't tolerate the drug at those doses. This therapy, once it gets approved, the first two drugs should be late June, early July, and then August. They're both injectable products. Both of them are forecasted to be injected every 2 weeks. One of them has a potential to be injected once a month. An interesting dynamic with that drug, instead of 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 3 to get the same dose, giving it once a month. What's that going to do to cost? They wouldn't answer that question. I was at a meeting last week with Amgen, who is developing that molecule, and they just don't have an answer yet for what the cost is going to be like. Several of the pipeline watching agencies that we subscribe to are forecasting anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 a year. Also there's a non-small cell lung cancer drug from AstraZeneca that's in the pipeline to be approved later this year. Then there's thyroid cancer, breast cancer, multiple myeloma, and Cosentyx was just approved. So that one's actually out on the market now. A couple of other areas that you might want to be aware of, that there's a lot of development work being done in the insulin category. Have you been following insulin as an inflation trend? If you've looked at it over the last 3 years, it's doubled in price. And the 3 years before that, it doubled in price. So it's been a fairly aggressive price trend just on the insulin category alone. Now the manufacturers are coming to the end of their patent life. They're creating what they're calling hyperconcentrated insulin so that you give a smaller volume, but it's still the same insulin. So that's the next thing that's coming to market. We call that kind of a patent life extension strategy. And then also there are some ultra rapid acting insulins that are coming out. So rather than Novolog or Humalog, you might see something that's administered and has an effect within 15 minutes of administration. So that's particularly important for folks that are not being regulated very well, that they need tighter regimentation of their insulin. And it's just another option that the endocrinologist can use. And then there's also some longer acting insulins that are coming out. Possibly we'll have a long-acting insulin, a basal insulin that might last up to 48 hours. So that's a significant improvement in that category as well. Patent expiration report. So some notables that are coming out of Abilify. If some of you have experienced some strong growth trends in the atypical antipsychotic drug class, this is the biggest drug in that class. So that generic is imminent, should be available towards the end of the month. And then, let's see, Copaxone was approved on April 16th, so that's already been released. Benicar is the last remaining branded drug from a class called, it's an antihypertensive drug. It's like an ACE inhibitor, only it's an angiotensin receptor blocker, or an ARB. And this is really the last significant molecule to patent expire, so that's going away at the beginning of next year. Zetia, for those of you who cannot tolerate or get the relief that you need from taking just statins, Zetia was an add-on drug. It actually works in the stomach and helps inhibit the absorption of cholesterol in the gut. That's going generic. And then a specialty drug, Lupron, and then everybody's favorite asthma drug, Advair Diskus. Now, just because the patent's going to expire doesn't mean there's going to be a generic. One of the problems that we've been challenged with in the asthma space is that the molecules might expire, but the technology to deliver those, the inhalers, is significantly difficult and challenging to replicate. So to get a generic substitutable inhaler out on the market is probably not going to happen. So what we'll see are clinical alternatives. So it'll be the same molecule, but a different delivery device. So I want to talk a few minutes about our clinical differences and why we think we have a pretty good strategy for managing drug cost trend. Now, first of all, I want to say that my report card every year is what our drug trend is for across our book of business. And I'm pretty proud to tell you that last year was negative 3.2%. And that includes specialty across our entire book of business. Now, some of that is because there were generic molecules available. A lot of that is because we reinforce how important it is to start with generics. Just because it's gone off patent doesn't mean it's a bad drug. And just because it's not the new thing doesn't mean it's still not a therapy option to consider first line when you're treating things like hypertension or hypercholesterolemia or some of the, or even diabetes for that matter. So there are a lot of effort that we put into sending information out to both patients and providers, letting them know that there might be an opportunity with their patient for a specific therapeutic class. They might be taking a brand. There might be 3 or 4 generic options within that class, and we'll show them, get a little bit of price comparison so they can understand what not only the economic advantages are of choosing that for the patient because their out-of-pocket's going to be lower, but also because it's got a similar clinical effect and they should have an opportunity. It doesn't always work for every patient, but it's one way that we help to get the information out to the providers. So formulary strategy is just one of the ways that we try to bend the trend, as it were. Utilization management, we have a lot of different edits that we put into place so we make sure that drugs aren't utilized more than what the FDA recommendations for dosing are, so we've got all those edits in place. We take a look at utilization trends within patients, so we're looking constantly at under and over utilization and looking at high utilization that might lead to substance abuse. So we've got narcotic programs, we've got 3 different surveillance activities going on in that area. We've got program integrity going on all the time behind the lines every night. All the claims are run through an algorithm and looking for outliers that might be submitting claims that are out of the norm, either in terms of quantity or cost. And then also integrated prescription programs. And one of the things that Cheri talked about was our One Magellan effort. So now we're starting to integrate lessons learned, if you will, from other sides of the business. From the behavioral health side, we're learning things like, they've got modules on sleep. And sleep is a real problem in our society right now. People are working longer hours, they're working harder, there's a lot of stress in people's lives, especially in 2-income earning families. So sleep is becoming more of a problem, and you can't just rely on drugs. There has to be a behavioral correction somewhere along the line. You got to turn the TV off. You got to give yourself some time to sit in the dark, if you will. So turn out all the lights, turn out all of the gizmos that are charging on your bedstand, because all of that ambient light has some impact on you. And there's all kinds of behavioral cues. So not only are we doing a mailing out to folks and letting them know, we also have edits in place to limit the length of time that they're on these sleep drugs, because they're not, some of them are what I guess you could call habit forming, and some of them just don't have good side effects. So they cause other problems like contributing to depression. We also purchased a company, I think last year, called Cobalt. And Cobalt is an interactive internet program where a patient can log in at their own speed and go through a module of 4 or 6 different lessons about a specific topic. So the first one that we're going to release out to our clients is going to be on sleep therapy, and hopefully we'll have that ready for you later this spring. A lot of effort now is being directed into specialty. When we became part of the Magellan organization, there was a company in there called Magellan, it's now Magellan Specialty. Before that it was known as ICOR. It's one of the leading edge specialty management companies in the industry. I've been very fortunate to be a part of working with them. They have a very robust physician engagement program, so we can work with physician networks to help bring some of the fee schedules more into line with what reality is versus what the network might be dictating. We can also work on patient engagement. So we've got a very unique program. There are some techniques that we are using to talk with our patients. Motivational interviewing was something that was developed by the behavioral health side of our company. And there's only about 80 instructors in the United States, and about 40 of them are working for Magellan. So we've been very fortunate to have that training and expertise incorporated into the interactions that we have with the patients. So it builds a very strong level of trust. They work with their care coordinator throughout the beginning of their therapy and then throughout their course of therapy. They're available 24/7 so that they can be available when patients begin to experience adverse events, when patients have questions about their medication, when the delivery isn't as timely as it might need to be. So all of those things, so make sure that the patient gets the right drug at the right dose at the right time. So that's the Magellan Clinical Cares program. I got a little ahead of myself. We've got something unique that I would like to demo for you, but we just don't have the technology set up to do that. For those of you that have a barcode reader or a QR code reader, this QR code, quick response code, is that square block on the side. If you hover over that with your phone, it'll take you to a video, and this is coming out with every specialty drug that we dispense going forward. And what this does is about a 3 or 4 minute video that talks very briefly about what the drug is, what the patient can expect, what it's used for, how to dose it, and any other significant pieces of information that can be crammed into that 4 minutes. Along with that, once they finish that video, you'll notice that there are 3 buttons at the top, about the middle top, just above the head of the gentleman that's in the frame there. That is connect buttons. And those hot buttons, the first one says connect me, and that'll take them right into the call center, right into a nurse or a pharmacist. So it will direct the phone. Obviously, you need a smartphone technology to do this, but it'll take them right into the call center. So right from, I've got this new drug, I don't really understand what's going on, can we talk about it a little bit, and then they'll go work through that with them. It'll also connect them to a Remind Me platform so we can set them up for refill reminders. In the works is going to be a daily dose reminder program so we can text or email a patient depending on what their chosen media is and let them know that it's time for them to take their next dose of whatever that medication is. And then the last thing on here is called Inform Me, and that'll take them out to a website. It's the NIH Daily Med site, and it'll give them all the detail that they want about the particular drug that they're using. So this is starting in the specialty side. We have a mail order, traditional mail order facility that's going to be opening up in third quarter, and that's also going to be available on the drugs that come out of that side of the house too. So that QR code will be printed on the prescription label that's attached to the bottle or the package, and it'll also be printed on the patient education forms that are printed, the 6 or 7 pages that you get when you go to the pharmacy every time for a drug. I think this is pretty cool technology. So what are we doing about hepatitis? 2013, a drug called Ivaldi was approved early in fourth quarter. And it kind of turned everybody's world upside down because suddenly the bar for a course of therapy became extremely high. Couple that with a population to treat about 4.5, maybe 5 million people. People got very nervous because all of a sudden they were seeing $35,000 and $40,000 per month of therapy showing up in their drug spend bills. And clients that had 1 or 2 or 3 patients became very anxious about what that was going to do to impact their budget. Then fast forward a year, standards change. October, Gilead comes out again with another Hep C drug, Harvoni. And then AbbVie comes out in December with another one, Vicura. So now we've got 3 drugs on the market. 2 of them treat only one of the 6 genotypes. Harvoni and Vicura, the last 2 that were approved, only treat genotype 1. Good news is it's about 70% of the US population. Bad news is there's only 2 drugs. We've been very diligent in how we approach the management of hepatitis C. We've engaged hepatitis C specialists, so hepatologists, infectious disease folks, and gastroenterologists. And we've engaged them for a number of reasons. Number one, we want to know, do we have to treat everybody that is diagnosed? The answer is no, we don't. We have to treat the sickest of the sick first. Absolutely, we have to do that because we have to slow the progression of the disease. The progression of the disease is it starts with an infection, and over time it starts to affect the liver. You develop fibrosis, then cirrhosis, and then you got to have a transplant. And if you don't get a transplant, then unfortunately you die. So the important thing was to get the folks that need treatment in stage 3 or 4, and it's called a Medivir score, and it's what's used to gauge how fast the progression of the disease has been in the liver and what stage they're at. So it's kind of like staging for cancer. And then we decided to draw the line there because most of the experts agreed that those were the ones that needed to be treated first. After all, we've got a limited pool of resources, right? Money and physicians. I saw a study last year that the capacity to treat hepatitis C patients is only about 250,000 patients a year. So that's it. So we're going to be treating patients for 10 years, if that is the case. So how do we decide which ones get treated and when do they get treated? So we use the Medivir score. We use the RNA score to find out what level of the infection is. And once it reaches a certain peak, then they qualify for therapy. We also use something called response-guided therapy. Response-guided therapy is a way to measure how effective the treatment is. Well, if you're not responding to therapy after 12 weeks, there really isn't much sense in continuing therapy. Because a lot of these patients, depending on what type of disease, what their stage of disease is, whether they have a Medivir 3 or 4 score, might need 24 weeks of therapy. So if they're not responding after 12 weeks, you have to make a hard decision on whether you're going to continue therapy or not. Bringing some lessons in from the behavioral health side, we incorporated some psychosocial criteria in the PA document that says that the patient has to have some skin in the game. If they come to be treated because of aberrant behavior, because either drug abuse or alcohol abuse, there has to be some commitment on their part that they're going to refrain from engaging in those activities during the course of their therapy. Because after all, you're paying for a $100,000 cure. I did say cure. So this is one of the first drugs that has complete cure. It doesn't mean you're going to have immunity once you've been cured. So you can contract the disease again depending on whether you have some contact with someone that has a disease or having sharing some injectable materials with someone, or some of the other vectors that are out there for the contagion for hepatitis C. So it's important that we have these measures in place so that the patient has some skin in the game. Because right now, a lot of these patients come in, they want the therapy, they're the right type 1, they're genotype 1, but their RNA factor isn't even at the threshold where they should begin treatment. So we've been very successful in kind of culling the herd, if you will, of the people that are demanding therapy and making sure that the most sick patients get it when it's appropriate for them. So what other options are out there? Well, on the pharmacy side, obviously you have to be very careful about how benefits are constructed, particularly if you're a grandfather program. You can't change midstream just because the cost of treating patients is getting over the top and it's not sustainable based on what your budgeting is for that year. So if you have an inclination to exclude benefits from coverage, the first thing you have to do is make sure that none of your patient population is using any of those drugs. Because if you try to exclude it when somebody is already on therapy, then you're going to run afoul of, you're going to definitely jeopardize your grandfather status. And by the way, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you legal advice. But I want you to make sure that you're aware that there are some options out there. You're not completely locked into covering everything all the time. On the medical side, did you have something that you wanted to?
I think just some of the things that we talked about is looking at your stop-loss contracts as far as what they do cover or don't cover when you're looking to do the carve-outs, and then just looking at the stipulations. Obviously, they're costly and high risk, and then the last thing is you want to manage it with a comprehensive clinical approach, which is what we've built. And one of the things that I think that Dick didn't mention on the Hep C that
that I always talk to my clients about is that one of the things that is, there is also drug testing that we do along with the therapy, and that's one of the clinical criteria as well. So it's just a real deep, look at, in the particular drug classes, what you need to be doing to manage these various situations.
So what's on the next wave? What's coming? We already talked a little bit about the cholesterol management. So the PCSK9 inhibitors, we should see both of those approved sometime during third quarter. Insulin category, talked a little bit about that already. So those costs are probably not going to abate much from where they are right now. And there's new molecules on the way that might change how patients are treated. One thing I wanted to talk about is new technology. So how many here in the room are familiar with the term precision medicine? Okay. Precision medicine is really getting down at the genomic level, getting down to the specifics of what's going on within a tumor. There are many factors that influence how oncology treatments are made available. So you've got a distribution of clinical trials all over the United States, but it's geographically concentrated in metropolitan areas for the most part. There's significant variability in patients' financial and insurance situations, and basically where patients receive their care. Is it a local hospital? Is it an academic institution? Is it part of a corporate chain? All those things have variables on what and how much and what types of therapy are available. Then there's increased awareness that patients have because of the internet about what's going on in clinical trials. And that creates some tension, if you will, with the practitioner that's trying to work with them. Genetic testing is probably far and away the biggest thing that's starting to influence a paradigm shift, if you will, towards precision medicine. And then the increased R&D momentum towards more targeted therapies. So these are therapies that do very specific actions at a molecular level at the tumor site. What we know from research so far is that no two cancers are the same, no two patients respond to the same therapy the same way, because tumors and immune systems are always in a state of change. So in this environment, it's because of that precision medicine is getting more momentum. Also, the government thought enough of this to create a $215 million grant to help create a database so that all of this research that's going on in targeted therapies can be researched. So there's up to 1 million patients that are going to be captured in this database so that there can be some research done on what those outcomes are. And then ASCO, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology, is creating a registry to capture information about off-label use. And this is why I bring this topic up, because this is where a lot of friction is starting to occur, because the reinsurance carriers, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is pretty much watching high-cost cases and looking for on-label and off-label use of drugs and then making adjustments accordingly. Because targeted medicine is becoming more commonplace, what's happening is it's called basket trials. So they'll take people with different types of tumors but have the same kind of mutation, if you will. Doesn't matter if it's lung or kidney or colon or breast or ovarian, if they all have this same genetic mutation, the theory is that they'll all respond to the same types of therapy that have that kind of inhibitor. So one, for example, is a drug called, or there's a gene called the BRAF human gene. It makes a protein that sends signals internally to the cells for growth. Now, tumors are nothing more than cells out of control in terms of growth. They're growing at a very rapid rate, and it's uncontrolled. So these mutations have been identified. This BRAF mutation has been identified in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, colorectal cancer, malignant melanoma, papillary thyroid cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, adenocarcinoma of the lung, and hairy cell leukemia and glioblastoma. These are all very different types of cancer, but they all have this one similarity in this mutation. And what they're finding is that they've had this one drug that was released in 2011, Zelboraf, and it's a BRAF inhibitor. And they've put a bunch of different tumor types in there. It was originally approved for malignant melanoma. Well, it's had a tremendous amount of success with glioblastoma. Those of you familiar with that, it's a very fatal diagnosis. About 70% of the patients don't respond to therapy and are dead within 10 years, or 2 years, I'm sorry. Actually, the longevity is about 15 months. So they're having some very significant improvement in patient outcomes. There are patients now that have had a 5-year survival timeline that have been on therapy because they started in a clinical trial and have continued throughout therapy and have been allowed to continue. So this is what we're faced with right now, and it's a dilemma both for payers, it's a dilemma for prescribers, and it's a dilemma for patients. So I'm not trying to advocate for any one of those three segments of the population, but it's intriguing to note that we have drugs that work but are prevented from being used because of their labeling. Don't know what that's going to change. It's probably going to take some regulatory intervention. I'd rather see some other alternative ways to get around that, but clinical trials are very costly. Clinical trials at a minimum are $150 million. It takes a clinical trial to get a new indication. If they can get approvals based on the research that's being done in all of these registries and databases that are being compiled, this might be a new pathway to expand the utilization of drugs across multiple indications instead of just the explicit indications they were approved for when they came to market. That's all I got.